Hey, all you true crime fans, this is Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morphin.
And we'd like to invite you to listen to our podcast, Criminology.
Launched in 2017, we've covered a variety of strange cases from murders to missing persons.
We dive into a variety of cases in both the U.S. and abroad.
Some of the cases are ones you may not have heard of, like the Pocatello babysitter murders or the Canal murders.
Other cases we cover are some of the most historic in true crime, like the Tylenol murders and the Lindbergh kidnapping. We also dive into cases that are currently breaking thanks to DNA and forensic genealogy.
Sometimes you'll hear from people connected to the cases, like the interview we did with the brother-in-law of the Golden State Killer, Joseph D'Angelo.
There are close to 200 episodes of Criminology available to binge on right now, including full seasons covering the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer, and Ted Bundy, and new episodes come out every Saturday night.
Subscribe to Criminology today, wherever you listen to your podcast.
You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, and 3 Men and a Mystery. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Traveling from their southeastern Asian country of Laos in 1975, where they lived in the mountainous region under communist rule, Choy Saechao and Choy Saelee had sought a better life in America, until one tragic morning 11 years later on a lonely stretch of Highway 99, just north of downtown Sacramento. Choy had previously worked on a chicken ranch as an egg picker in Newman, just south of Highway 132, and Patterson in Stanislaus County, but was forced to give up due to a hand injury he sustained. Choy, who was 48, and Choy, who was 40, had left their Dorman Road residence in Yuba City on April 21, 1986, for the 2.5-hour journey to Merced, California, to visit their son, who had been involved in an automobile accident 3 months earlier. They had also bought a light blue Mercury while in Merced for the journey back home to Yuba City. Although accidents had blighted their lives, even they couldn't have envisioned what lay in store for them in the early hours of April 22, 1986, as they traveled along Highway 99, approximately 3 miles north of Sacramento. The couple were only 45 minutes from home when they pulled over to the side of the highway, either for a brief rest or because a trailing vehicle had guided them into this position, perhaps using similar tactics described in the Highway 132 abduction of Kathleen Johns on March 22, 1970. Either way, they were approached by a single gunman who proceeded to unload a barrage of small caliber fire into the driver's window, blowing out both front and side windows of the vehicle in what can only be described as a merciless execution. The couple had no chance of survival as 15 projectiles hurled towards them, delivered from an unknown assailant, an attack that has been described as seemingly motiveless by law enforcement. The exact time of their murders has not been pinpointed, but it's been reported as occurring between 3:30 and 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday, April 22, 1986. Shortly afterwards, somebody described as a hitchhiker in the newspapers flagged down a California Highway Patrol officer in East Nicholas and informed him of an accident on Highway 99 by an Interstate 5 intersection. The officer would respond and find the deceased bodies of Saechao and Saelee in their recently purchased 1983 Mercury. The California Highway Patrol officer didn't take a name from the concerned citizen who had stopped him, and we currently have no description or sketch of the apparent helpful member of the public. East Nicholas is approximately 25 miles north of the crime scene, so presumably if this man was a hitchhiker, he had recently acquired a lift from a passing motorist who had now vacated the scene. The other possibility is the concerned citizen wasn't a hitchhiker at all and wanted to play games with law enforcement in absence of his vehicle. This attack virtually mirrored the attack at Blue Rock Springs on July 4th, 1969, when the Zodiac also fired numerous projectiles through the window of a vehicle in a motiveless and senseless crime that claimed the life of Darlene Ferrin. After the attack on Michael Mageau and Darlene Ferrin, in similar fashion to the murders of Saechao and Saelee, the Zodiac also made contact with law enforcement, maybe in absence of his vehicle, when he called the Vallejo Police Department in a game of cat and mouse that he possibly later created in 1986.
One could be forgiven for thinking that this was the end of the story, but according to the Sacramento Bee newspaper, the hitchhiker appeared to be continuing his game. Either that, or he was a very, very concerned citizen. The newspaper stated, 2 victims, Choy Saelee and Choy Saechao, were found dead in their car by a hitchhiker about 6:30 a.m. Sometime later, the hitchhiker reported what he had seen to authorities in Marysville. Who those authorities were in Marysville is uncertain, but Marysville in Yuba County is 16 miles further north and 35 miles from the crime scene. The same newspaper would then release a much more comprehensive article about the murders, stating, police discovered the bodies sitting upright in the front seat of the Mercury after a hitchhiker told a Chico, California highway patrol officer he had witnessed a car wreck at the Freeway interchange, Sergeant Bob Burns said. Chico is a further 42 miles from Marysville and 77 miles from the crime scene. It is highly unlikely the Appeal Democrat and Sacramento Bee newspapers just pulled East Nicholas, Marysville and Chico out of a hat, suggesting that the hitchhiker could possibly be the most committed upstanding citizen in California, reporting an accident to 3 different police forces over a 77-mile journey in absence of a vehicle. If these reports were logged at specific times, it would go a long way to determining whether the hitchhiker could feasibly have flagged down several vehicles to achieve such a journey, and go a long way to concluding whether he owned his own vehicle or not. Whatever the case, this would seem an extraordinary act of public service to report his observations over jurisdictional lines 19 miles, 35 miles, and 77 miles from the scene of an accident in Sutter County, Yuba County, and Butte County. This could easily be construed as somebody who was playing games with law enforcement, not dissimilar to the games played by the Zodiac Killer in the Bay Area. An officer with the Yuba-Sutter California Highway Patrol said the witness obviously didn't reveal everything he saw, suggesting that the hitchhiker may not have been telling the complete truth. Despite the fact this extremely concerned hitchhiker apparently reported the accident over a 77-mile journey, he apparently failed to contact authorities when the police made an appeal for him to do so. I have reached out to the Sacramento Police Department for more information on this case and to provide them with some supplemental information regarding the murders, but unsurprisingly, like most police forces, they failed to respond.
If that wasn't enough, exactly 2 weeks later, a letter postmarked May 6, 1986, arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, stating, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am still out here and crack-proof. I want you to know about the latest slaves that I have collected about 2 weeks ago, up by Sacramento, California. I will give you a clue to help you with the mystery. They were killed by a freeway. The blue meanies almost caught me. The body count is now growing, 100 plus all over the state of California and NA, which possibly meant Nevada." It's clear that this communication is referring to the murders of Saechao and Saelee, because the author mentioned slaves and the plural pronoun of they, indicating more than one person was killed. The statement of about 2 weeks ago perfectly matched with the April 26, 1986 date of their murders, and the author stating they were killed by a freeway near Sacramento matched exactly the location their light blue 1983 Mercury was found by police. The question we now have to wrangle with is, who was responsible for the murders, and who was responsible for the letter? Or were both the same person, possibly the Zodiac? On January 1st, 1986, The cartoonist at the Chronicle during the Zodiac murders, Robert Graysmith, released his long-awaited book, Zodiac, which, as expected, flew off the shelves and received much publicity. So was the appearance of the Zodiac letter just 4 months later the result of a hoaxer? Or was it written by the Zodiac himself, galvanized into action by the renewed interest in the Zodiac story? The 1986 murders, despite their striking similarity to the attack at Blue Rock Springs on July 4, 1969, quite likely may never be solved, or proven one way or another to be connected to the Bay Area murder known as the Zodiac. But that doesn't mean the Zodiac didn't mail the communication. How would he have been fortunate enough to still be scouring newspapers beyond the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and Vallejo Times-Herald in 1986 to stumble across a crime that so mimicked his attack at Blue Rock Springs, and possibly used the ruse that pulled Kathleen Johns to the side of the road on Highway 132 on March 22, 1970? Unfortunately, this letter was withheld from newspapers, and a connection to the Saechao and Saelee murders to this letter was never made, at least not publicly. The letter is the first known communication claiming a link to a specific crime since the July 13, 1971 Monticello card, which possibly associated itself with the murder of Kathleen Billick in Saratoga on April 11, 1971.
So was it the Zodiac killer or an imposter who wrote the 1986 letter? The way we go about this is to compare this communication with a strongly argued Zodiac letter such as the 1987 letter, shown recently to have firm ties to the Vallejo Times-Herald envelope mailed on July the 31st, 1969. Several document examiners claimed the October the 28th, 1987 letter to be from a lazy forger who mimicked the Zodiac killer's 1978 letter. Therefore, what they are arguing for is a 1987 hoaxer who decided to mimic the only widely publicised Zodiac letter considered a hoax to convince you they were real. Then, with no knowledge of the only other envelope mailed to the Vallejo Times-Herald in 1969, which wasn't publicly released, managed to use the exact same 13 words on the envelope, the exact same lack of punctuation, and very likely spelled Herald with the letter O instead of a letter A, just like the 1969 envelope and the only other publicly known communication mailed to the Vallejo Times-Herald when the September the 25th, 1990 Celebrity Cipher landed at their offices. This should prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the 1987 letter is genuine. The 1986 letter was not in the public domain by the time the 1987 letter was mailed, yet both of these communications carried the flag over capital stamp, and both communications used the same phraseology. The 1986 letter began with, "I am still out here and crack-proof." The 1987 letter began with, "I am crack-proof." Both letters using the same separated format of crack-proof. The 1986 letter stated, "The blue meanies almost caught me." The 1987 letter stated, "Tell the blue pigs if they want me, I will be driving around on Halloween," and "The pigs can catch me if they find me out there." Therefore, the author in both instances began with a claim of being crack-proof, and both mentioned blue pigs or blue meanies with the possibility of him being caught. The last time this phraseology was used was in the March the 13th, 1971 Los Angeles letter. Yet here we have two consecutive communications in 1986 and 1987 using this phraseology, despite the fact the 1987 author should have had no knowledge of the 1986 letter because it was unpublished. Since the 1987 letter is almost certainly the Zodiac killer, it follows that the 1986 letter is genuine too. We can now say, with arguments beyond a reasonable doubt, that the Zodiac killer wrote the 1986 letter about the murders of Choy Saechao and Choy Saelee. What we cannot say is whether he murdered them or not. All we can do is point out the similarity to the attack at Blue Rock Springs and the possibility he used a ruse similar in fashion to the one he employed when he pulled over Kathleen Johns in 1970.
The 1978 letter began with the phraseology of, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am back with you. Tell Herb Cain I am here." The 1986 letter began, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am still here and crack-proof." And the 1987 letter began, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am crack-proof. Tell Herb Cain that I am still here. I have always been here." Where would Zodiac have picked up this phraseology from? The San Francisco Chronicle wrote on August 26, 1976, about Inspector Dave Tosky's pursuit of the Zodiac, in which he stated, "It's been one of those weeks when there have been a lot of nickel and dime leads popping up in the Zodiac case. I feel he's out there. I feel he's going to surface." The Zodiac possibly utilized these words when he resurfaced in 1978, beginning with, "I am still here." Inspector Dave Tosky would repeat the sentiment 2 days after the April 24, 1978 letter, when he was quoted in the Chronicle stating, "I have always felt he was alive and out there, somewhere." These words may still have been pertinent to the killer in 1986 and 1987, when he wrote, "I am still out here, and I am still here. I have always been here." The Chronicle article on August 26, 1976, about David Tosky's relentless pursuit of the Zodiac, in which he stated, "I feel he's out there," may have held particular significance to the Zodiac, and may be why he responded to this in his opening line of the 1978 letter. The Chronicle article on August 26, 1976 not only carried this quote by Dave Tosky, but someone also placed a personal ad in the paper that same day. That personal ad read, "Zodiac, your partners in deep real estate. You're next. The Imperial Wizard can save you. Surrender to him, or I'll terminate your case. R.A." It seems in some ways this 1976 personal ad and the quote by David Tosky are bound to the 1978, 1986, and 1987 letters by wording spanning over a decade. This shows the running theme of very likely one author, who was always avidly glued to the newspapers detailing him and his crimes. The Zodiac was a narcissist who craved the public's attention, and almost certainly scoured the newspapers for stories about himself well into the 1970s and 80s. But whether the Zodiac was still prepared to kill as late as 1986 is another matter. The Zodiac possibly insinuated his involvement in the Snoozy and Furlong murders, the murder of Sergeant Richard Raditich, the disappearance of Donna Lass, and the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, but in none of the letters he provided any actual proof of his involvement. The 1986 letter regarding the murders of Saechao and Saelee would also contain no evidence he had any part in their brutal murders. But one fascinating aspect of this crime lingers: the hitchhiker who appeared to be the most helpful of concerned citizens.
Whether people believe the 1986 letter is authentic or a hoax is irrelevant if that determination has been arrived at simply by looking at the handwriting. If someone is boldly declaring a letter a certain hoax, then it requires that individual claiming such certainty to provide evidence such as fingerprints or DNA from the killer to compare to the questioned letter, in order to make some inroads into backing up their claim. Just saying a letter doesn't look like Zodiac and declaring it a hoax just doesn't cut it. Regardless of this, the unfettered confidence people have in their ability to just look at a communication without any research into that communication and boldly declare it wasn't authored by the Zodiac killer will continue unabated. Whatever communication we examine, it is imperative that we examine each thoroughly, discovering whether the author of each communication had knowledge pertaining to previous confirmed communications that he shouldn't have known. Without fingerprints or DNA, this is the most compelling argument we have, and was comprehensively demonstrated by comparing the Exorcist letter envelope to the 2 Zodiac envelopes from April 1970, which hadn't been publicly released, effectively proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the Exorcist letter was authored by the Zodiac killer. Whether the Zodiac Killer was invigorated by the recent release of Robert Graysmith's 1986 Zodiac book and turned up on Highway 99 in Sacramento on April the 22nd, 1986 to murder this couple, or he just stumbled across this double slaying in the newspapers that so resembled one of his previous crimes and laid claim to it, will likely never be known. What standard of evidence collection and storage was performed in 1986 cannot be ascertained, but we have 15 bullets and 15 casings, totaling 30 pieces of ballistic evidence in this case. But without the cooperation of the Sacramento Police Department, or this crime being revisited by a cold case team, the chances of a resolution to these horrific murders are practically zero. Choy Saechao and Choy Saelee arrived in America seeking a better life. They got that dream for a short time, before their lives were cruelly snatched away by another psychopath with a gun. A relative of Choy Saechao and Choy Saelee said, "We don't want to get killed in the United States. We want to live here for freedom." Unfortunately, freedom will always be limited when people such as the Zodiac Killer exist in our society.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
After the murder of the couple, a concerned citizen effectively contacted 3 different police forces in East Nicholas, Marysville and Chico over a 66-mile journey. Once the concerned citizen had informed the first officer in East Nicholas, he seemingly continued northwards, reporting these murders as an accident twice more. We have statements from officers at these locations, including Sergeant Bob Burns. If these statements are correct, and the newspapers have reported it correctly, do we have an amazing conscientious hitchhiker repeating what he saw 3 times? Or do we have a killer playing games with the police? Or do we have the Zodiac Killer inspired into action by the publicity surrounding Robert Graysmith's book released 4 months earlier?
Well, there's a lot of interesting possibilities here. I think first regarding the crime itself, it seems like a Zodiac-esque crime, the random shooting of a couple on the side of the road someplace and sort of out of sight. So that part does have the Zodiac overtone. And then obviously contacting the police is another part of Zodiac's MO. We know that he liked to do that. He liked to get the attention. He'd like to steer the authorities to what he had done. So that seems in line with him. I think, whether it's a hitchhiker, whether it was the actual killer that was moving along, trying to contact these different agencies, could be hard to say. And whether that killer is the Zodiac is also hard to say. There's just not enough there. But some of the stuff is definitely Zodiac's MO as far as the crime itself and then the contact of the police afterward.
People seem to think that I believe it is the Zodiac Killer, but I don't actually think the Zodiac Killer was responsible for the murders, although I can't fully rule it out. But we have newspaper articles from the Sacramento Bee twice and one from the Palo Alto Times. And they reported East Nicholas, Marysville and Chico. What do you think of the likelihood that they got these completely wrong and it was just one report, one hitchhiker from one location, and they just got the areas incorrect? Do you think that's likely?
I tend to think not, because why would they just randomly pick these 3 towns out and include 3 different towns? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they're super close to each other. So
no, they were 66 miles apart, and they were all along the same route northwards.
Exactly. So to me, I don't think they would just randomly pick 3 towns out accidentally. I think there was some kind of reason for them to state those 3 towns. But it's interesting that they are along the same route. So, make of that what you will.
The murders themselves were 3 miles north of downtown Sacramento and a few hundred meters from an interchange with Interstate 5. Do you find that this would be an unusual place to take a rest when they could have easily pulled off the main highway a few minutes earlier or a few seconds later? In other words, is there a possibility they were pulled to the side of the road, just like the Kathleen Johns affair?
Oh, I think that's absolutely a possibility. And then could they have been pulled over? Were they driving, or did they see someone flagging them down saying, I need help? Perhaps they pulled over for that reason. So I think one way or another, the fact they pulled over there is a little bit telling. I think they were either forced to or conned into pulling over there. But again, we're talking a brutal murder. And if it's not Zodiac, it's just further evidence of how frightening it is that there's just that many random killers out there, especially in California in the 60s and 70s. That was just a breeding ground of different offenders and serial killers and predators. So for them to sort of be out there in the large numbers, the way it seems like they were, that's pretty scary.
Would it be fair to say the killer was likely in a car, bearing in mind the location?
Yeah, I would think so, unless, we have this hitchhiker that's walking all that distance and committed the crime and he just decided to keep on walking. That could be a possibility. And I don't know if it's been explored, but one possibility, at least in my mind, as I'm thinking about it, what if the couple gave this person a ride and he gunned them down getting out of the car, said, I need to pull over here or something. They pulled over and then he shot them for whatever reason. Could be a possibility. And then they walked away from the crime scene. So unfortunately, there's just not enough there to really know.
No, it's certainly a possibility I hadn't thought of, but I twice contacted the Sacramento Police Department after connecting the 1986 murders to this letter to find out whether they had made this connection themselves and could they give me any more information on this crime and whether a sketch of the hitchhiker had ever been drawn up or they had any description of the mystery man. But again, no response whatsoever. We have in total 15 bullets and 15 casings in this case. So it would be interesting to discover the possible gun used, its caliber, and their general thoughts on this seemingly helpful man. I hope the listeners can do a little digging and push this case forward because I've had no luck. I've contacted them twice and they haven't replied. I'm 100% satisfied the 1986 and 87 letters are from the Zodiac killer. But even if they are not, they are almost certainly from the same person. It had been 15 years since Zodiac used the word crack-proof, yet both of these communications used the separated form of crack-proof on the second line of each correspondence. Both stated he was still out there, both mentioned the police by way of blue pigs and blue meanies, and both mentioned the notion of being caught by using catch me and caught me. The fact that one letter followed the other and the 1986 letter hadn't been published in 1987 has to indicate one author, in my opinion. You have your own interest in a suspect. Do you think, in general terms, it's incumbent on people who have suspects to analyse these later communications in more detail? Because if their suspect was still alive during their mailing date, they could discover clues within the communications they might otherwise have missed.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at all those letters and consider all of them regardless. Again, I go back to, the confirmed ones up to 1974. I consider them all to be confirmed. Maybe with again, there's a little bit of an argument about one of the 74 ones that might be fake. And we could talk about that in a whole episode. But, for the most part, they're the accepted letters and I consider them the accepted letters. And the ones after that, I sort of look at each one. And some of them are certainly interesting. Some of them have some clues to them. For example, the Eureka letter, I look at that a little bit closer. There's been a lot of attention on that one lately. And, my suspect, William Andrew, is someone that owned property in that area. So, that caught my attention. And in this episode, we're talking about this person going to Chico, providing these details, and that was an area that my suspect spent quite a bit of time in, is Chico. So these are two areas that are no place close to Vallejo, yet, we are talking about these two different areas, Eureka, Chico, etc. So from that standpoint, I think it's interesting to look at them and consider the possibility, could they be legit letters? I'm a little bit downhearted about the questionable findings in some of the writings and stuff. We had the whole fiasco of the confirmed Riverside letter, turns out not to be from the Zodiac. We're sure Morrill thought it was. But it's not just this case. There's other cases, too, where some of the question writing and documents have come under fire. So I'm just becoming less and less excited about handwriting, per se, because of the fact it's not an exact science. It's not like fingerprints or DNA. Those are bits of physical evidence that are, there's science behind them. And whereas handwriting, it really comes down to opinion. But beside that, it definitely seems as if the 86 and 87 letters could have been written by the same person. I'm in agreement with you there. And it's just a question of, is that person the Zodiac or a copycat? We may never know.
Well, expanding on your suspect a little bit then, if these locations of East Nicholas, Marysville and Chico are correct, the concerned citizen or killer travelled 77 miles from the crime scene along Highway 99. His direction of travel seemed purposeful. Highway 99 joins State Route 36, which leads directly to Eureka, which comes into play 4 years later. Can you remind us of Mac's connection to Eureka and his possible use of Highway 99 on a regular basis?
Well, see, he owned property in McKinleyville, yeah. And that's right outside of Eureka. Now, Tom Voigt brought up an interesting thing that I didn't know until he told me, but he had done some research and he found out that any letter mailed in Humboldt County would get a Eureka postmark. It's postmarked out of the Eureka post office. So again, what's interesting to me is, if it was Vallejo and the town over where there were some different communications coming from, if it was Fairfield or Vacaville or something like that, you could say, okay, it's all in Solano County. It could easily be Zodiac. But I think a lot of the doubt has been cast on some of these ones that are 200 miles away from Vallejo, like Chico or Eureka, these areas that are not very close to there, yet there's possible Zodiac communications coming from Eureka, for example. So in the past, people said, well, sounds like a crazy nut way out there. That's not where Zodiac was attacking. He was attacking Vallejo 200 miles away. This is just some kook out there. Well, maybe it's not. Maybe this person, whoever Zodiac was, has a connection out there, such as Mac owning property out there. So I think you have to sort of consider the possibility that Zodiac, whoever he was, had business, had property, had something out in these other areas that aren't close to his normal stomping grounds, and maybe give them a little bit more attention because he could have done some mailing, some correspondence when he was traveling out in these areas for whatever reason.
Because Vacaville is near Sacramento, isn't it?
Yeah, so those two areas are close. Sacramento, Vacaville, all in that general area. You get like a Chico or Eureka, you're really going out a great distance out, sort of into the boondocks, I guess you would call it. You're going out into areas that aren't as populated. They're a lot more open. Humboldt County is really a large wooded area. It's where a lot of, marijuana growers grow their product and stuff on farms out there. So it's a different area than Vallejo, Vacaville, those areas where you think Zodiac would normally be prowling, where there's lots of people to interact with, lots of victims to find. Here you get into an area that's a lot more open and secluded and sort of far away from everything. So if, again, this is a big if we could ever prove Zodiac was definitely in Eureka or in other areas, perhaps Chico or in these other places, you have to say, what's his connection there? So I think it's worth considering stuff that is out of that area. But in this case, we're talking about specifically today, you have the attack in close to Sacramento, yet these correspondences from the supposed hitchhiker are going further and further away out towards, this area of Chico. So if it's Zodiac, why is he out there? That's what I think you have to ask.
Have you connected Mac to Chico at all?
Well, Mac went to Chico for college for 2 years. He had an apartment there. He lived with several different people that were in college there. So there's Definitely some connection there. And taking a step further, we did the Donna Lass case before we took our break for the holiday season in 2021. And I even recall a name, and I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but someone there had a Chico connection, which I thought was interesting because, again, not really near Donna Lass or Lake Tahoe, not really near the Vallejo activity of Zodiac, but here we are talking about a possible Donna Lass victim, and the name Chico, that town pops up in the middle of that. So again, that when you see that, it just makes you sort of stop and take notice of it.
I looked into Chico a little bit, and what I found is nothing new, but for the, say, word specialists out there, you probably already know this. The town of Paradise is in Butte County, 10 miles east of Chico. And if you look on Wikipedia, the legend persists that it was named after the Paradise Saloon, an idea supported by a railroad map referring to the town as Paradise, spelled with the letter C, just like Zodiac, not to mention the Halloween card. So that's an interesting little connection to Paradise and Chico.
Yeah, and if Zodiac was aware, if he knew that history, if he spent time in that area, he might know that little clue and throw it out there in a letter, and it just sort of went over everyone's head. They just said, oh, we misspelled it again. Well, if he knew that area, knew the history of it, and knew the spelling that it was used in that instance, he might have thrown it in there as a clue, and it was totally missed.
Do you buy into these word connections like this, or do you think that's just coincidence?
It's hard to know what he was thinking. I think there were a lot of clues in his letters, and maybe we just didn't catch them all. I don't think he threw stuff in there just to just throw them in there for no reason. Like the one that always comes to my mind is that Paul Avery, where you underline the L-A and V. I don't know what he was trying to get at, but I think he was trying to give us a clue there. Again, what it is open to debate, but I don't think he just did that just to do it and it didn't mean anything. I think there was something there he was hinting at. So when you see little clues in some of the writings, you have to, in my opinion, you have to sort of think, what kind of clue might he be giving us here?
Now, the Robert Graysmith book, Zodiac, was released in January 1986, so police might have considered the possibility that this could reignite the Zodiac killer into his murderous ways, or to write more communications to the newspapers. The Zodiac was a big story back in the day, so any potential Zodiac letters in 1986, one might have expected to be newsworthy because people like sensationalism. So why was this letter apparently not published in the newspapers? Robert Prouty, a documents examiner, claimed in 1987 he was analysing 15 hoax Zodiac letters a year. So why were the newspapers reluctant to publish them to boost their sales? Did law enforcement have any sway over the newspapers' right to publish?
Well, maybe they were just getting so many of them. They just said, hey, we can't just print all these, and they made the decision not really to print any of them. Because again, as you mentioned, the new Zodiac book coming out might inspire Zodiac to write again. But at the same time, it would also inspire a lot of hoaxers and people that want attention to write as well. So they may have just made the decision, look, let's just not publish every supposed letter we get from someone calling himself Zodiac. And I think maybe that's the approach they took. But, something we talked about in another episode, I'm of the opinion they should try and do DNA on any kind of letter that ever came in from anyone claiming to be Zodiac and try and identify the author. And if they can, if there's enough DNA to work with and they can find someone and connect them to the letter, then they can do a fuller investigation and say, was this person really the Zodiac or was it just some nut that wanted some attention? They should be trying to do that in every Zodiac correspondence that there is, in my opinion. Or possible Zodiac correspondence.
Yeah, I just find it strange that newspapers and the media aren't always bothered about the truth. And I would have thought any sort of communication that remotely looked like Zodiac, they may have capitalized on.
Well, again, maybe there's a thin line between putting something out there just to sell newspapers or get attention, even if seems like it could be fake. Or maybe, again, since we don't know what happened behind the scenes, maybe they reached out and maybe they said, hey, we're going to run this letter. And they reached out to police, and police said, no, we don't think it's legit. You shouldn't run it. And they made the decision not to run it. We just don't know.
In 3 podcasts' time, we'll be covering the Molina and Rodriguez murders in 1967, the Hood and Garcia murders in 1970, and the murder of Anthony Vincent Bruno and the attempted murder of his girlfriend in 1975. Have you found any other attacks on couples, Mike, in particular around the area of Eureka, or even Nevada or Oregon, because they're neighboring states?
Well, it's a challenge going back and looking through old news archives, looking for those. So, I'm limited obviously to what I have access to online, and there's a couple of good sites you can use, newspapers.com, newspaperarchive.com. They're good ones for finding a lot of newspapers, but they really only have a drop in the bucket as far as what newspapers are out there. If you were to go look at local libraries and search different newspapers, I'm sure you'd find a lot of attacks where there are couples parked on Lover's Lane, because it's a good target area for anyone just trolling, looking for a victim. It's quiet, it's secluded, it's dark. So you can go all across America and find lots of different murders like that have that same MO. But, obviously anything that's focused right in a certain area of California during the right time period would have a little bit more focus on it. But as far as I remember, though, I don't remember seeing a lot in Eureka and Chico. I specifically looked in those areas looking for Lover's Lane type killings, and I didn't see any that jumped out. So again, unless I don't have access to all of the different papers that might have detailed them, there might just not be any that were in those areas.
What couple murder most likened to the Zodiac case have you found?
Well, the one that is quite striking, and we will get into it, is that Molina Rodriguez case in Alameda County. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. We know Zodiac was in that immediate area because he mailed correspondence from there. And this is 1967, before the first official Zodiac murders in 1968. And there's just a lot of similarities when we get into the episode between their attack, the way things went down, and the way things went down at Lake Herman Road. And we'll talk about some of that in that episode. And
their ages were quite a bit older than the Zodiac victims, weren't they?
Yeah, and that's a key difference, is that they were older, they were Hispanic, whereas the typical Zodiac victims were Caucasian, younger people, with the exception of Paul Stein. He was a little bit older. But to me, if you're patrolling an area looking in Lover's Lanes and you come upon a car and force the people out, you're not going to know who they are ahead of time. It could be anyone. And in this case, it just happened to be a Hispanic couple that were older. So, in that instance, a Zodiac attack on them, he wouldn't know who he was attacking until he got him out of the car. Although, again, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. There's instance that someone was harassing that couple way earlier than the attack.
How old were they, roughly?
It's been, I want to say they were around their late 30s or early 40s.
So not dissimilar to these 1986 murders, because they were in their 40s.
Yeah, so that would be something similar. And again, they weren't Caucasian either. This couple here was Asian, and this couple was Hispanic. So again, doesn't mean they're definitely Zodiac victims, but some of the MO certainly has some Zodiac parallels.
I don't think the ages were particularly relevant, because it was all about just getting attention and being newsworthy for the Zodiac killer, wasn't it?
Sure. And I think it certainly seems like his intent, what made him happy later was getting attention for his crimes. But I think, and this is just my opinion, I think when he started, it was because these were the kinds of people that he was jealous of, the things that he wanted in his life. someone to spend time with and be out with on the weekend, and maybe go out and on a lover's lane with a girl, that he wasn't able to do that. And I think he sort of was jealous. And I think that's sort of why he targeted people that were in those areas, because it was something that he wanted and he couldn't have. I think that was his initial catalyst into starting these attacks. But later on, I think it sort of became the attention that he got from them.
In the next episode, the next podcast, we will be covering the Lake Herman Road murders in great detail. So let's make a comparison between the 1968 murder of Faraday and Jensen to the 1986 murders. When Officer Pierre Bidou returned to Benicia PD after serving a search warrant at the cottage on Lake Herman Road, initially he was told a woman was lying outside a car and they thought they were being sent to a crash. Bidou, when he arrived at the turnout, stated that he realized it was no crank call. Captain Daniel Pitter, who radioed in what he had been told by Stella Medeiros, surely wouldn't have been interpreted as a crank call because it was over the police radio. So did a phone call come in at about the same time as Daniel Pitter radioed in, or likely shortly before? Officer Bidou stated this decades after the crime, so this could easily be dismissed. However, in the Argosy magazine in September 1970 on Tom Voigt's site, it stated that the Zodiac killer had laughed in his phone call to Vallejo police in December 1968. If the Zodiac killer had rang Vallejo police in 1968 reporting an accident, we have a similar scenario in 1986 with somebody reporting murder as an accident. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the ultimate focus, the ultimate attempt is to just get police out there. Because if you call up and you report an accident, the police are obviously going to respond to it. So then they'll go there, they'll find out it's not an accident, it's a murder. But your whole point is getting them out there. And later on, he would just, the Zodiac, we know he switched to flat out saying, I killed some people and here's where you're going to find them, because that would definitely get their attention. But it's definitely worth noting that there was an attempt to get police out there to those scenes, whether it was an accident or turned out to be a murder. Just the intent was there to get them out there.
So do you think there's a possibility a phone call may have been made by the killer after the murder?
I think it's possible. Now, I've gone through a lot of different reports for Solano County and the Lake Herman Road murders, and I've never seen a mention of a call afterward, but that doesn't mean there wasn't one that somehow was taken out of the report or held out of the report, whatever. So as of, now, it would just be speculation. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Twisted Travel and True Crime. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
This is Twisted Travel and True Crime. Welcome aboard. Let me entertain you with crazy travel stories, true crime stories, and survival stories from all over the world. I've covered insane asylum murders, being buried alive, a crazy trip to Kinky Cottage, as well as being trapped under 100 feet of water for 60 hours. I can't forget to mention plots for financial gain, serial killers, and so much more. Please listen to Twisted Travel and True Crime on your favorite podcast platform.